Hey, what you reading for?
Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel where I talk about books, literary horror classics, and contemporary, and where I love making book quizzes for you. If you're new here, thank you for stopping by. I hope you enjoy the content, and I do hope you consider subscribing. The more the channel grows, the more content I can produce, and I do appreciate the support. In this quiz, there are 4 categories: Booker Prize winners, contemporary horror or 21st century horror, books with successful movie adaptations, and finally, books my mom likes. In each category, there will be 3 questions or 3 books. I will read a short extract of a 1-star review that has plenty of clues in it. And if you don't guess the title right away, no panic. I will give you 4 options, and then I will give you 4 seconds to make your choice before revealing the answer. After each question, because I can't help myself, I will give a few thoughts on the book and my experience with it. Should be a lot of fun. I will say that there is a good chance that one of these books, at least one, perhaps several, will be books that you love. It's important to remember that no matter how great a book is, there are always bound to be some haters, some people who will leave 1-star reviews. We can't let that get to us. Now, let's kick it to the great American composer John Adams for a short intro sequence, and I'll see you on the other side to do the 1-star review book quiz. The first category is Booker Prize winners. Now, the Booker Prize started in 1969 and is given to a novel that the jury believes is the best novel written in English for that year and published in the United Kingdom or Ireland. So there are no works in translation in this category. The first Booker Prize winner that this disgruntled reader wrote, I sort of respected the fact that it had one moderately interesting first act of a relatively standard length, followed by one super tedious, highly repetitive, seemingly interminable second act, followed by a super short third act that was all resolution and no action. A tagline for the book is that it's a book that will make you believe in God. It didn't make me believe in God. It didn't make me believe in anything except the stupidity of taglines. What a pretentious load of crap. If you haven't guessed the title straight away, I'll give you 4 options. Is it The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy, Life of Pi by Yann Martel, Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie, or Possession by A.S. Byatt? And I will give you 4 English seconds to decide. 4, 3, 2, 1. Life of Pi by Yann Martel. Now, I have mixed feelings about this book. While I was reading it, I was really into it. I thought it was interesting and compelling, that I liked the main character and the way he describes the different religions in India and how they coexist. I love animals, so the fact that this protagonist is on a raft with different animals and interacting and surviving with them, I found it fascinating. However, at the end of the read, when I was finished, I was left a bit underwhelmed and less than satisfied. And the book didn't really have much staying power with me. It didn't have a lasting influence on me. So mixed feelings. For the second question, I do need to apologize in advance to any Australian viewers. The The disgruntled reader left a review in Australian. I am not going to do my Australian accent, but I do risk butchering a few of these words. I'll do my best though. Thank you for understanding. This disgruntled reader wrote, Crickety Chinas. I thought I'd need the ambo. I was a caught case. At first I thought, she'll be apples. I'll give it a burl. But then I realized my noggin was cactus. I was cheesed off and about to do my lolly. Fair crack of the whip. I had Buckleys of sussing out the lingo. Thought I was a drongo, a no-hoper. But stone the crows! This was a stinker for me as a reader, a write-off. If patois is defined as a form of a language that is spoken only in a particular area, then I am not going to rate myself as a fail for not enjoying the struggle to read this. The pidgin dialect was a struggle, and the story itself jumped between points of view and the timeline, and close to 700 pages of unstructured language and plotline. Clever? Maybe. An effort to read? Totally. Whew, that was a mouthful. Now, is the book that this reader is referring to, is it The White Tiger by Aravind Adiga, The Bone People by Keri Hulme, The History of the Kelly Gang by Carey, or A Brief History of 7 Killings by Marlon James? And I will give you 4 Australian seconds to decide. 4, 3, 2, 1. A Brief History of 7 Killings. Now, I watched a YouTube tutorial on how to do an Australian accent, and the advice they gave was that you have to make each word 2 syllables. If it's only 1 syllable, you stretch it into 2, and if it's 3, you condense it into 2 syllables. So that's the technique I used for my Australian accent. Let me know in the comment section how I did. Actually, don't let me know in the comment section how I did. I know how I did. I nailed it, didn't I? Now, A Brief History of 7 Killings. It's true that there are several passages in this book that are written in a Jamaican patois. I found it fascinating. It was a great way to get the reader immersed into that setting, and I was all in. I read this book when I was living in Poland, in Gdansk on the Baltic Sea, and in winter. So I'm riding the bus, reading A Brief History of 7 Killings. I'm really into the story. And I'd get off the bus and I'd look around and there would be snow on the ground and white people everywhere. And I was disoriented. Wait a second, this isn't Kingston, Jamaica. I must have gotten on the wrong bus. And that happened to me frequently reading this book. I loved the way it was written. I loved the unique storytelling. I had a lot of fun with this book. I can understand why some people weren't into it. It was challenging at times, but for me, it was definitely worth it. Third question. Third book. This disgruntled reader wrote, Maybe I'm just sick of identity politics, but this book, at this moment, seemed more pedantic than satirical. I prefer novels with a concrete plot, relatable and multi-dimensional characters, and a philosophical stance that allows you to think for yourself rather than be force-fed redundancies ad infinitum. What book could that disgruntled reader be referring to? Is it The Conservationist by Nadine Gordimer, The Sellout by Paul Beatty, The 7 Moons of Mali Almeida by Shian Karunatilaka, or Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo? And I will give you 4 French seconds to decide. 4, 3, 2, 1. The Sellout by Paul Beatty. Now, I was feeling generous when I read this book. I gave it 2 stars. I really did not like it. I used to host stand-up comedy open mics, which were brutal. Always the same jokes about the same tired premises based on racial stereotypes. It was painful. But what was worse than that was that sometimes the audience would laugh. It drive me crazy. I'm like, please don't encourage that. Reading The Sellout reminded me of these horrible experiences. In fact, there are a few scenes in The Sellout which literally take place at a stand-up comedy open mic where they do these racial stereotype jokes. In fact, the whole book is just racial stereotypes and playing off of it in a way that it thinks it's clever. Me, I found it tiresome. The next category is contemporary horror or 21st century horror. And for our first entry, this disgruntled reader wrote, "Perhaps I'm missing something. This book was on so many lists of must-read books, and there are so many favorable reviews, but I just don't get it. It's very badly written, full of humongous plot holes. For example, many months after the cataclysmic event, they decided they needed some dogs. So they looked in houses. They found some. How had they survived with no food or water? There were loads of plot holes like this. Sorry, no can do. I hate the way this book is written. If you want to write a movie script, please don't put a cover on it and call it a novel." Which contemporary horror book is that disgruntled reader referring to? Is it World War Z by Max Brooks, My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix, Horns by Joe Hill, or Bird Box by Josh Malerman? And I will give you 4 Hungarian seconds to decide. Negy, három, kettő, egy. Bird Box by Josh Malerman. I had a frustrating experience with this book. I went to the bookstore. I wanted to read a horror novel. I see Bird Box. I think, oh, Josh Malerman, he's from Michigan. Cool. And this is his first novel. I'm going to check it out. So I buy the book, and then I go home, and it's a relatively thick book. It's a good-sized novel, right? I go home, I open it up, start reading, and the print is quite large, which is nice. I have poor eyesight, so I appreciate that. But the chapter starts with a text halfway down the page to leave room for a sketch of a bird, which is nice. It's a nice presentation. But the chapter is like 2-3 pages long, and it ends with the text halfway down the page, leaving room for a sketch, same sketch of the bird. And then there's a blank page separating the chapters. And then it repeats with each chapter being 2 or 3 pages long. And about 20 to 25% of the book is a preview chapter for Josh Malerman's next novel. So what I thought I was getting a novel, I was paying for a novel, but it's really a short story stretched out to be sold as a novel. I was disappointed, I was frustrated, I didn't enjoy the read, I didn't like the way it was written, very simple sentences all on the surface. In fact, I was so upset and I felt ripped off, that I actually thought about writing a letter to the publisher and asking for my money back. Ultimately, I didn't, but it did not leave a good taste in my mouth. Not a good experience for me. Next entry from this disgruntled reader who writes, "Is he capable of writing about anyone outside of a small town? Same old small town characters, book after book. Sure, these are often nice, liberal, open-minded small town people, but small town people nonetheless. And it's not just that these people are in small towns, they stay in small towns. They never have any interest in going anywhere, except maybe other small towns. The author's characters are strangely incurious about the world, like a nation full of George Bushes. Also, when the author brought 9/11 into the story, I had to roll my eyes. And it only got worse from there. And hasn't the author done the whole scary thing that steals kids multiple times already? Which book could that disgruntled reader be referring to? Is it The Outsider by Stephen King, Joyland by Stephen King, Dr. Sleep by Stephen King, or Lizzie's Story by Stephen King? And I will give you 4 Portuguese seconds to make up your mind. 4, 3, 2, 1. Dr. Sleep by Stephen King. Now, I loved this book. For me, it was a 5-star read. I have a theory that many readers or some readers didn't like this book because they remember The Shining from a nostalgic filter, and they read it when they were teenagers, young teenagers, and they're reading Dr. Sleep and they're hoping to get that same experience, but they're not young teenagers anymore, and so they're kind of disappointed. Me, I did not have the benefit of nostalgia. I did not read Stephen King when I was a teenager, when I was a young adult. In fact, I read my first Stephen King. It was Revival, which I think came out in 2014. So I was a middle-aged man at that time. And I really liked it. And I read Dr. Sleep when it came out the following year. Loved it. And it was only several months later, maybe a year or two later, that I read The Shining. And I was underwhelmed, to be honest with you. For me personally, since I don't have the benefit of nostalgia, I have a strong preference for Stephen King's later or more recent works. I think that over the course of his career, writing book after book after book, I think he's gotten a lot better at it. I do like some of his early books, but I definitely prefer his more recent ones. And Dr. Sleep is my favorite of his. And for the last entry in the category of contemporary horror, this disgruntled reader wrote, "It felt like the book was written solely for the purpose of being as gross as possible. The author needs to get a dictionary before throwing around medical terms like some kind of big brain scientist, and a 10-page description of the torture and killing of a kitten is just sick and unnecessary. Though written with a penchant for incredible imagery and appropriate nastiness, a thin plot, derivative characters, and unfocused pacing makes for an all-in-all whack piece of work." Is this whack piece of work The Troop by Nick Cutter, The Final Girl Support Group by Grady Hendrix, The Hunger by Alma Kaitsu, or The Ritual by Adam Neville? And I will give you 4 Polish seconds to make up your mind. 4, 3, 2, 1. The Troop by Nick Cutter. Now, I had a good time with this book. I know that a lot of readers, or at least the 1-star reviews that I looked at, they complained about the brutality towards animals. I love animals, so that should have bothered me, but it didn't. I was just sucked into the story early on, and I went with it, and I had a blast. There's this group of young boys, Boy Scout troop. They're stuck on an island. I believe it's Prince Edward Island. So there is a survivalist aspect to it, which played really well on me. And there's body horror, and it's quite graphic at times. So there's a lot to enjoy if you're in the mood for that sort of thing. And I thought it was well done, well paced, and effective. And I had a blast with it. Our next category is books that would go on to spawn successful movie adaptations. And for our first entry, this dissatisfied reader wrote, "Dear author, I simply do not like your style of writing, And I have been ridiculed by fanboys who will defend your honor to the grave. Your style comes off as unique, but I can feel the pretentiousness like a piece of meat stuck in between my teeth. You know full well that a vast majority of your audience shops at Hot Topic, and you lead them by the fishnets to your thin plot lines, monotone voice, and the gritty and edgy characters that seem to recycle themselves with your stories. Keep appealing to your trendy fan base and keep raking in the dough. Maybe someday I will swallow my pride and appeal to the masses just like you and James Patterson. Best wishes, Sarah. Which book could that be? Could it be Fight Club by Chuck Palahniuk, Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn, Less Than Zero by Bret Easton Ellis, or American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis? And I will give you 4 Arabic seconds to decide. Arbaiton, Tharahaton, Ayetnani, Wahidon. Fight Club by Chuck Palahniuk. It seems like that reader is condemning Chuck Palahniuk for being unique, which doesn't seem fair. I think that Chuck Palahniuk, in his first few books, he took Fight Club and what made Fight Club so good, and he took those characters and that vibe and that format, and he kept working and reworking and tweaking it with each of his successive novels. And his fifth try was Choke, and I think that's when he really nailed it. And then he switched and started experimenting with horror. But I haven't read all of his books, but for me, so far, Choke is my favorite. But Fight Club is an outstanding debut. It's quite impressive. I like Chuck Palahniuk a lot. There was a time, maybe, I want to say 6 or 7 years ago, where I read several of his books, like 5 or 6 of his books, like one right after the other. And that is probably not the best way to experience his work, I think. I like Chuck Palahniuk a lot, but I think it's perhaps best to experience his work every now and then, reserve it for special occasions, at least for me. But I really liked Fight Club. I thought it was a very impressive debut, and I liked the movie too. Great movie. For the next entry, this disgruntled reader wrote, "This book did not age well. I didn't really jive with this book, and the casual racism was cringeworthy. I didn't buy into any of the characters. I didn't believe the number of men fawning over the protagonist, each of them falling in love with a high-class escort who constantly entertains other men at the same time, yet they all want to marry her. There wasn't anything about her personality that screamed marriage material. I honestly don't know what anybody saw in her. I didn't get the charm, the elegance, the wit, or why this character went on to become iconic. Literally nothing redeeming about this book except that it is blessedly short." Now, what book could that be? Could it be The Help by Catherine Stockett? Bridget Jones' Diary by Helen Fielding? The Devil Wears Prada by Lauren Weisberger? Or Breakfast at Tiffany's by Truman Capote? And I will give you 4 Albanian seconds to decide. 4, 3, 2, 1. Breakfast at Tiffany's by Truman Capote. Now, I loved Breakfast at Tiffany's. For me, it was a 5-star read. I loved the perspective. I loved the character, Holly Golightly. I feel like she had a very hard go of it in life. And I feel like she was willfully naive. That was the only way that she could cope, that she could get on with her life. And it worked for her. And I just loved the whole vibe of the story. I was charmed. I haven't seen the movie, so I don't have that comparison to make. And I know that the movie is quite different, especially in the characterization of Holly Golightly. So I can imagine that's why people who are familiar with the movie, they might not like the book I only know the book and I loved it. Moving on to our last entry in this category. This disgruntled reader wrote, "Everyone knows the story, but guess what? That is not the book's main plot. The novel is more about the decline of a marriage than anything else. I had to skim through an entire conversation of a woman having an affair and talking about her rape fantasy over dinner. Who fucking orders egg salad and a glass of milk at a diner? What book could that be? Could it be Jaws by Peter Benchley, Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton, Rosemary's Baby by Ira Levin, or The Notebook by Nicholas Sparks?" And I will give you 4 Korean seconds to decide. Ne, se, 둘, 하나. Jaws by Peter Benchley. This book, in my opinion, has one of the best opening scenes in all of horror. It is excellent. Unfortunately, after that scene, we do go off on a tangent, a very long tangent about this woman and her affair, which has nothing to do with the shark, and it's quite dull, and it's not what I got the book Jaws to experience. Then it does go back to the water, and then we go after the shark, and I like the way that the book ends. I could do without that whole middle section about the affair. I would agree with the reviewer that that was unpleasant and unnecessary. But the opening, wow. Our final category is books that my mom likes. But not everyone likes these books. For example, from this disgruntled reader, "The language is simple. Maybe I'm supposed to perceive it as deep, mysterious, or simply written in a beautiful way, but I just found it dull. I was so tired of hearing about snow. I guess I just skim over this flowery language because it's so meaningless to the story. If I want imagery, I'll read some poetry, not this snowy schlock. This language is flowery to the point of making no sense. A waste of the reader's time to ask them to parse out the convoluted imagery." Could that reader be referring to Snowflower and the Secret Fan by Lisa C., Snow Falling on Cedars by David Guterson, A Breath of Snow and Ashes by Diana Gabaldon, or The Snowman by Joe Nesbo? And because my mom is from Michigan, I will give you 4 Michiganian seconds to decide. 4, 3, 2, 1. Snow Falling on Cedars by David Guterson. I watched a YouTube tutorial on how to do a Michigan accent, and they said to put all the sound into your nose, which is what I did, but I don't think it sounded right. I must not have a Michigan nose. Oh well, I tried. But what I didn't do is I didn't really try to read Snow Falling on Cedars. I think I made it maybe 10 or 15 pages into it. It has kind of a folksy style to it, at least in the dialogues, and I just wasn't up for that. I was in a weird headspace at that time, so I didn't really give it a fair chance, to be honest. Maybe I will go back to it one of these days. Probably not, but maybe. For our second entry, this disgruntled reader wrote, "Reading this book is like eating an unsalted rice cake. It's food, and you can almost convince yourself you enjoy the texture, but unless you're starving or devoted to a minimal calorie intake, you may be like me and wonder, why bother? The characters of this book are like grains of rice in said flavorless rice cake, in that they are present, but may as well all be the same. Some are good, a few are bad, Some are not white and don't get to be good or bad, but could be summed up just as succinctly as other. What book could that be? Could it be Charlie's in the World of Wonder by Marley Yeomans? Works of Mercy by Sally Thomas? Death Comes for the Archbishop by Willa Cather? Or The Help by Catherine Stockett? And I will give you 4 Spanish seconds to decide. 4, 3, 2, 1. Death Comes for the Archbishop by Willa Cather. Now, I quite liked this book. I read Death Comes for the Archbishop when I was in the middle of doing my 4-part video retrospective of horror from the 1970s. So I was reading lots and lots of horror books, one after the other. And I just needed a break. I needed to read something pleasant and something nice. So I picked up, on my mom's recommendation, I picked up Death Comes for the Archbishop, and it was exactly that. It was pleasant and it was nice. I loved the way it was written. I loved the slow, easy pace to it. I liked the protagonist. It's a story of a white European man who goes to the New World, led by his faith, and he goes there to New Mexico to help the people there practice their faith. Now, I read a lot of these 1-star reviews that really didn't feel like critiques of the book. They felt more like opportunities for virtue signaling. They said things like, oh, this is another white European male who goes and tells native people what to do. And what about all the horrible things that the church does? Well, this isn't that book. This isn't the book that's going to expose all the crimes of the church. This is a book about one man's perspective, one man's experience. And yes, he is a man, he is a white European, but it's still a valid experience. It's still a valid perspective. It's one among many. I got the feeling from reading these reviews that these people want so badly to tell me how open-minded they are that they close their mind to people whose perspective or experiences don't allow them to tell me how open-minded they are. In any case, if you are reading lots and lots of horror books and you just need a break and want to read something nice, something pleasant and well written, I would give Death Comes for the Archbishop a high recommendation. Which brings us to our final question. And for our final book, this disgruntled reader wrote, Dire. The writing is along the Dan Brown lines, with flowery metaphors mixed until they become meaningless. From page 1, my father sighed, hiding behind the sad smile that followed him like a shadow all through his life. How can he be hiding behind it if it is following him? Don't be fooled by this book. It is insipid, lame, and poorly written. First, the prose is so overblown that the author uses 3 adjectives for every single noun. Count them, 3. Always 3 and only 3. Second, the author must have looked up every word in a thesaurus and chosen the one that was most obscure or had the most syllables. Third, every character in this book speaks with exactly the same voice. The whole thing feels like it desperately wants to be seen as some kind of profound parable, but the only result is that the characters are just implausible symbols. They are too bland even to hate, unlike the book itself, which I loathed. And what book could that be? Could it be The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss, Voice in the Wind by Francine Rivers, or The Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafón, or Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell? And I will give you 4 Turkish seconds to decide. 4, 3, 2, 1. The Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. As for me, I have not read this book. My mother loves this book. She talks about it often. She tells me that I would love the book, but I am a terrible son. I have not read it. How many of these books have you read? How many were you able to guess? Were the clues too easy? Too difficult? I look forward to your feedback, which will help me make these quizzes better and better. If you would like to support this channel, that would be fantastic. You can subscribe. I have several books out. You can buy a book and leave a review. You can leave a kind word in the comment section. I appreciate the support and I thank you for watching. I'll see you at the next video.